Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Gabriel Noah Brahm, Director of the Center for Academic and Intellectual Freedom. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for a truly special event, an evening with Benny Morris, the leading historian of the Arab-Israeli conflict. To promote civil dialogue, discussion, and critical thinking about inherently difficult issues, Professor Morris's lecture will be followed by a substantial Q&A period during which anyone who wants can pose a question and get a response from the guy who wrote the book on the subject, literally, and we have microphones ready for that. Before we begin, tonight's lecture is co-sponsored by the Jewish Student Union, and we have a brief announcement from the president of the Jewish Student Union, Emma Fellows.
Hi, my name's Emma Fellows. I'm the president of the Jewish Student Union. I just have a quick little endorsement about the club. We don't have a political or religious agenda, but we are open to conversations regarding the subjects. And we have a lot of opportunity for different events, such as tonight's, but also we can get together for cultural gatherings like a Shabbat dinner or meet for coffee to discuss conversations such as the ones that will be presented tonight. And yeah, we're very excited to be involved in events such as these and to welcome Benny to Northern tonight.
Before we proceed, I thought you might like to know a few things about the center itself, and we also have a brief awards ceremony to perform, about which more in a minute. The Center for Academic and Intellectual Freedom is now in its second full year of operations. Our website is up recently, so if you haven't seen that yet, please take a look, thecaif.org. You can sign up there for our mailing list as well. Please do, that way you won't miss any of our exciting upcoming events. Plans for next year include a visit to the center by the famed libertarian economist and transgender activist Deirdre McCloskey on October 23rd and 24th. She'll be speaking about the benefits of capitalism, if you can imagine such a thing, on an American college campus. Mark your calendars and watch for announcements about that unprecedented event. Moreover, in case you're interested in our broader purposes, tonight's speaker is part of our 2018-2019 series of lectures and seminars for faculty, students, administration, and staff that we call Safe Space for Open Inquiry. The idea is to provide intellectual and moral space for rigorous investigation of humanly meaningful questions, regardless of political pressure from any direction, and without succumbing to the pressure to treat college students like babies, or faculty for that matter. With that in mind, the next speaker in the Safe Space for Open Inquiry series this year is Greg Lukianoff, co-author with Jonathan Haidt of the best-selling book, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. Lukianoff will be on campus April 22nd to meet with students, faculty, administration, and staff. There will be no coddling then, and there will be no coddling here tonight. As of just a few weeks ago, the center became affiliated with the FAR, or Fund for Academic Renewal, in Washington, D.C., as well as the ACTA, American Council of Trustees and Alumni. I'm pleased to say we're grateful for their support and proud to have been named recently the 68th member of the ACTA's Oases of Excellence Network. Tonight's excellent oasis is made possible in part by a generous grant from the Student Finance Committee here at Northern, and is, as I mentioned, presented to you by the Jewish Student Union in cooperation with the center. My thanks to the SFC, and in particular JSU's President Emma Fellows. Thanks also to the center's Board of Advisors, some of whom are here tonight, our undergraduate and graduate student fellows, And a heartfelt thanks to all of you for supporting Open Inquiry by showing up here in the rain. This is not a workshop, so your attendance is not at all interpreted necessarily as agreement with what you will hear. It could turn out that way, but it doesn't have to. That's up to you. There are no thought police here tonight. Most of all, I want to thank my research assistant, my podcast host, my Sancho Panza, if you will, Mr. Timothy Eggert. Whatever we've managed to accomplish this year at the center, it's thanks to a partnership of which he is fully one half. And with that, I come to the presentation of the Lois and Willard Cahotis Literary Prize Awards for this year. The prize contest was established in 2006 on the occasion of the 65th wedding anniversary of Lois and Willard Cahotis. The prize was established by Rabbi Samuel and Lynn Stahl and Nancy and Paul Oberman, and we're grateful to them for the contest, which they generously fund. There's a cash award that each essay winner will receive, and the goal of the competition is to provoke serious thought about one or more of the following topics: enhancing racial, ethnic, religious, sex, gender, national, and cross-cultural understanding, eliminating racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and hatred of the other, advocating respect for universal human rights around the world, and remembering the Nazi Holocaust of European Jewry. The first prize, by the way, is substantial. It's $500. The second prize is $250, and the third prize is $100. We thank the donors for their generosity. We miss Bill Cahotis, and we wish Lois well in her 104th year. Now that's longevity. And with that, I present to you the winners of this year's Cahotis Literary Prize contest. They'll come up in turn, and I'll present them with the certificates. The third prize winner this year, there's a tie, actually, and I don't think we have both of them, but I'll say both of their names. Kelsey Hibbard wins the third prize for an essay called Identity Theft, an essay on the Nazi Holocaust. Is Kelsey here? I don't know if she is here. Is Kelsey here? Oh, wonderful. Sorry. Now I remember. Also winning third prize, it's our first year ever that we had a tie. We had well over 20 fantastic entries this year, and we had to award 2 for the third place. There was no way around it. Isabel Nebel, is Isabel here? Okay, great. Everybody is here, I guess, after all. Speaking of genocide is Isabel's essay, an essay on genocide in the 20th century, including in Rwanda, Cambodia, the German Nazi genocide in Poland as well. Elizabeth Mansfield has won second prize. Is Elizabeth here tonight? Great. Come on up, Elizabeth. Elizabeth's paper is titled Thinking Differently, A Look at Disability Prejudice in Past and Present. And the first prize winner is Caitlin Sternberg. Is Caitlin here tonight? Great. Caitlin wrote a fantastic essay, as everyone did. Hers is titled Sharing Terror, and it's an essay on terrorism in the age of the internet, with a focus on terrorism directed at Muslims, as we recently saw in the New Zealand atrocity. So with that, I present the certificates in recognition of their achievement. Isabel? Congratulations. Professor Benny Morris was born in Kibbutz Ein HaHoresh in north-central Israel in 1948, the same year that the country was born, or reborn, and moved with his parents to Jerusalem the following year. The son of a diplomat, he grew up both in Jerusalem and also New York City, where he graduated from the Ramaz Yeshiva High School of Manhattan in 1966. Like most Israelis, he served in the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, in this case as a member of the Nahal Paratroops Division. He was wounded by an Egyptian shell in 1969 near the Suez Canal and saw fighting again in Beirut, Lebanon in 1982. In 1986, he did reserve duty in Judea and Samaria, commonly referred to as the West Bank, and in 1988, when his unit was called up for reserve duty in that same area, on that occasion, he refused to serve and spent 3 weeks in jail. So he's an outspoken guy, a man of conviction who not only says what he thinks, but does what he thinks right. He's not only a soldier, however, but also above all a scholar of the highest order. He received his bachelor's degree from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, going on from there to study in England, from whence his parents had emigrated, earning his PhD in modern European history at Cambridge University in 1977. So you're looking at someone who is to some degree the product of not only Israel, although he is that, but also the US and England, hence the unplaceable accent which you're about to hear. After graduation, he worked for more than a decade as a journalist at the Jerusalem Post. That was from 1978 to 1990. From 1997 to 2015, he was on the faculty of the Middle East Studies Department at Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba. Upon his retirement from there, he served from 2015 to 2018 as the Goldman Visiting Israeli Professor in Georgetown University's Department of Government. He has published a number of very important books on the Arab-Israeli conflict, including The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem in 1988, which shook up the consensus and changed the character of the understanding of that issue. Righteous Victims, A History of the Zionist-Arab Conflict, 1881 to 1999. The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, Revisited in 2003. And my own favorite of his works, 1948, A History of the First Arab-Israeli War. If you're looking for something that's both very good and short to read as an introduction or overview of the conflict, I highly recommend his book of 2010, One State, Two States. For his early work, he became known as one of the new historians in Israel, a phrase or nom de guerre that I believe he himself coined and which continues to resonate as a proper noun, referring to him and a handful of others who discovered new information about the 1948 Israeli War of Independence and the Palestinian Nakba associated with it. He's not so new anymore, perhaps, but he's still a historian. Later this month, Harvard University Press will publish his much-anticipated new volume, The 30-Year Genocide, Turkey's Destruction of Its Christian Minorities, 1894 to 1924. From what I've seen of it, having read an advance copy and what the world knows of him, the book promises to significantly upgrade, if not revolutionize, our understanding of that crucial period in Middle East history, including the Armenian genocide and more. It's really a book about the genocide and ethnic cleansing of Christians from that region, including Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians. And I think the Italian translation is even called something like the genocide of the Christians. He's also a public intellectual of the first rank, not only a historian. He has written for the New York Times, Newsweek, commenting on public affairs, the LA Times, the New Republic, the New York Review of Books, the Guardian, the Observer, and more. He currently lives outside of Jerusalem on the side of a lovely hill in a charming village called Lyon, or alternatively Srigim. It has two names, it seems, although I'm not sure why. He's one of Israel's leading citizens, one of the most consequential historians of our time. I'm pleased to say he's also my friend. Please join me in welcoming to NMU the indefatigable, sometimes controversial, always unflappable, an icon of what it means to stand up for free speech and freedom of expression when it really counts, Benny Morris.
I'll just put a map on the screen. I think we're okay. It's not doing anything. Okay, that would have been
was
fine.
there.
It was there, yeah. That's fine. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk about the 1948 war. First, thanks to Professor Brown for his exaggerated introduction and for inviting me here. I've sort of spent on and off the last 30 years studying the 48 war. I wrote about the Palestinian refugees. As Gabe said, I wrote a book summarizing the war called 1948. And what I'm really going to give you now are some of the conclusions I reached after these 30 years and which are embedded in the conclusion of the book on 1948, which was published in 2008. Well, the 1948 Israeli-Arab War, the first Arab-Israeli war, was definitely the most important of the Israeli-Arab wars. There have been 5, 6, 7, it depends how you count what is a full war, but there have been 5, 6, 7 over the past 70 years. But 48 was, without doubt, the most important. It changed the geopolitics of the region. It embedded in the Middle East, at the heart of the Arab and Muslim worlds, a Jewish state, in fact, cutting the Arab world and the Muslim world in two, something for which has left bitterness in the Arab and Muslim worlds towards Israel, without doubt. And it also created the Palestinian refugee problem, which remains a major problem in the Middle East, certainly a major obstacle to any Israeli-Arab and Israeli-Palestinian peace settlement. The war was the result of Jewish immigration by people who call themselves Zionists, who wanted to reestablish a Jewish sovereign state in the ancient Jewish homeland, the land of Israel, called Palestine by the British. They began settling in the 1880s. The Jews in Palestine, the Arabs in Palestine, growingly resented this influx of settlers, of Jewish settlers. There were bouts of violence by the Arabs against the Jews, and these culminated after about 50 years, 60 years in the eruption called the 1947-49 war, the 1948 war. The war was triggered. The Turks initially ruled Palestine, the Ottoman Empire, until 1917-18. The British took over Palestine 1917-18 after they conquered it and ruled there for 30 years until 1948. In 1947, early 1947, the British said we're leaving. They'd had enough of ruling over Arabs who had rebelled against them, against Jews who had rebelled against them, and in face of these two ethnic communities in Palestine who refused to make peace with each other, were at war with each other, the British sort of gave up and announced they're handing the problem over to the United Nations and withdrawing in 1948. And the United Nations General Assembly in November 1947, after studying the problem, they sent a commission to study called UNSCOP. They resolved on the 29th of November 1947, the UN General Assembly recommended a partition of Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, and this resolution triggered the Israeli-Arab War of 1948. The Arabs rejected it, the Arabs of Palestine and the leaders of the Arab community, Arab states around Palestine rejected the UN resolution saying Palestine was all Arab, was all ours, it shouldn't be divided, the Jews should have no part of it. The Jewish leadership, by and large, the mainstream Jewish leadership, David Ben-Gurion, Chaim Weizmann, accepted the UN resolution, even though traditionally the Zionists had also claimed all of Palestine for Jewish sovereignty. By the late 30s, they'd given up on this and had agreed to a partition, and in 1947 said yes to the United Nations partition resolution. The Arabs of Palestine, as I said, opposed the resolution supported by the Arab states and essentially began a civil war against the Jewish community in Palestine, supported by Arab states with arms, volunteers, and so on. The war actually began on the 30th of November, the day after the UN resolution was passed. Arab gunmen began to shoot at Jewish buses, at Jewish civilians in mixed towns, and that's how the war began. It began spontaneously, incidentally, not as a decision of the Palestine Arab leadership, but shooting here and there, perhaps triggered by orders, perhaps not, but from above, and then it snowballed into a full-scale civil war. Now, the war which had erupted was an unusual type of war, the 48 War, unusual by any criterion. It was a mixture of a civil war, which was followed by a conventional war between states. From November 47 until mid-May 1948, it was a war between two communities, the Arab and Jewish communities in Palestine, which was then ruled until May 1948 by the British, by a third party. But the communities were fighting each other in this civil war, which the Arabs of Palestine had launched against the Jews. This civil war was followed immediately when the British departed on the 14th of May. On the 15th of May, after Israel declared its independence, or the Jewish community in Palestine declared the establishment of the State of Israel, this was followed by a conventional war, which began with the invasion of Arab armies from outside, the armies of Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Jordan. They invaded Palestine on the 15th of May and attacked the newborn Jewish state. And that war lasted in terms of the hostilities until January 1949. The civil war ended with Arab defeat, Palestinian Arab defeat, and the conventional war ended with the defeat of the invading Arab armies, and the State of Israel was then established. The war ended formally. I said the hostilities ended in January 49. The war ended formally in July 1949 after the signing of 4 armistice agreements between each of the Arab participants in the invasion, apart from Iraq, which incidentally remained in a state of war to this day with Israel because it never signed an armistice. But the other invaders, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon, which hadn't participated in the invasion, we'll maybe get to that later, they all signed armistice agreements with Israel, ending that war. And that's how the war came to an end by mid-1949. In studying the war, I came to a number of conclusions which I'll now share with you, some of which are accepted by other historians, some of which are controversial. The first conclusion I came to was regarding the nature of the 1948 war. Traditional historiography, Israeli, foreign, and so on, saw the war as a war between two nationalist groups and states, nation states, over territory, a political national war. Even if it was somewhat different from the normal wars between nation states, because wars between nation states usually are fought over borderlands. France and Germany fight over Alsace-Lorraine in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. They don't fight about destroying each other, but only about conquering a little more territory, a little less territory along the borders. This was an unusual political national war in the sense that the Palestinian Arabs in the fight wanted all of Palestine. In other words, they were fighting not over borderlands, but over the whole land. So in that sense, it's an unusual nationalist war. But I would say that it wasn't just a nationalist political war. It was also a cultural and religious war on the part of the Arab side. If you like, one can simply embody that in one word, jihad. It was fought as a jihad as well as being a national political war. I'm not saying it wasn't that as well, but it was also a jihad in the minds of many of the Arab participants. It wasn't, incidentally, a religious war from the Jewish side, because the Zionist movement traditionally had been secular, was secular until 1948. The people who led Zionism, the people who manned the Zionist legions, if you like, were secular and in fact anti-religious by and large. There was only a very, very small segment of the Jewish population in Palestine which was religious, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5%, depends how you exactly count it, but they were inconsequential in terms of the Zionist movement, the leadership, the military, political leadership, and so on. So from their point of view, from the Zionist point of view, from the Jewish point of view in Palestine, it wasn't a religious war, it was a political nationalist war, but from the Arab side, it was also a religious war. And I'll give you some instances of why I believe, and some of the argumentation why I believe it was a religious war from the Arab side. There is a problem, incidentally, in defining a religious war. What does it mean exactly? If the leadership says it's a religious war, do all the people agree that it's a religious war they're actually embarking on, etc.? And especially when you talk about non-democracies, dictatorships, autocracies, you don't really know what the people are thinking. There's no elections, there's no votes, there's no referendums. Most of them are illiterate. We're talking about the Arab side at the time. They don't keep diaries. There's not that much material about what the people are thinking. We have some evidence about what the leadership is thinking. Again, this is partly problematic because the Arab archives are all closed. The archives of Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and so on are all closed to researchers in terms of the 1948 war. So we don't actually know what's in the archive and what the leaders were actually saying or doing, commanding their armies to do, etc. But we'll get to that in a second as well. But we do have some bits of evidence that show that it was a religious war on the Arab side. One of the major pieces of evidence is that the ulama of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which is, of course, the oldest university in the Arab world, but its ulama, its council of sages, council of theologians, is the most important determinant of religious policy, of the authority. It's the most important religious authority in the Sunni Arab world, which is the dominant stream of Islam. And the ulama of Al-Azhar in December, on the 2nd of December 1947, 4 days after the UN resolution, declared jihad. They passed a fatwa saying all Muslims must join in this jihad. Able-bodied men should join the armies. Those not so able should send contributions. But they declared jihad against the Jewish state, which was then about to emerge. They repeated this fatwa, this religious ruling, calling on the world's Muslims to join the fight. They repeated it in April 1948 in advance of the Egyptian and Pan-Arab army's invasion of Palestine. In other words, to give that coming invasion a religious imprimatur. And they repeated it again, this interestingly, in December 1948, after the Arabs had essentially lost the war. In other words, they were saying, well, we've lost this war, this round against the Zionist enemy, but this fatwa, the idea of jihad, must be carried on after to a next round, the second round, the third round, whatever would be necessary. But this is the religious decree. This is what must happen. A woman called Matiel Muranam, who was a Lebanese Christian who had moved to Jerusalem and married a Muslim, and then she became the head of the Women's Association associated with the Arab Higher Committee in Palestine. The Arab Higher Committee was, if you like, the government of the Palestinian national movement led by a man called Haj Amin al-Husseini, and it had a small women's component. Not very important, but she was the head of it, this Christian woman from Lebanon who had married a Muslim and moved to Jerusalem. And she gave an interview in January 1948. And she said there, this is a quote from the interview, "The UN decision has united all Arabs as they have never been united before, not even against the Crusaders. A Jewish state has no chance to survive now that the holy war has been declared. All the Jews will eventually be massacred." And this is a Christian woman talking about the Muslim world going to jihad. There's other bits of evidence, lots of bits of evidence. King Abdullah of Jordan, who was the most liberal, open-minded of the Arab leaders around Palestine in 1948, also when he accompanied his troops who were about to cross the Jordan River, said, "Some of you will die, you will become martyrs, and others of you will, of course, survive and enjoy the benefits of this victory over the Jews." He was speaking in jihadi terms as well. That's about the nature of the war. What I'm saying is it was political, nationalist, but also a religious war from the Arab side. A second conclusion which I reached refers to the war aims of the various sides. And here we enter some field of controversy. There are arguments about some of what I'm going to say among historians, Israelis included. Firstly, from the Jewish side, I believe there were three war aims. The first war aim in both parts of the war, the civil war and the conventional war, the main Jewish aim was survival, that is to weather the Arab onslaughts, the Palestinian Arab onslaught, and after May 48, the Pan-Arab assault. To weather these and to survive as a state. This was the initial main aim of the Jewish side in the war. From April 48, I believe, accrued to this war aim, another war aim, a secondary war aim, which was to expand the area of the Jewish state to be beyond what the United Nations Partition Resolution had endorsed. The United Nations Partition Resolution had said the Jews should have 6,000 square miles of Palestine's 10,000 square miles for their state. The war ended with the Jews having 8,000 square miles. In other words, the Jewish state expanded, and I believe this was a result partly of the way the war was fought, but also partly as a result of the will of the Israeli government to expand the territory of the Jewish state. It's worth adding to that that the Jewish state did not capture, the Jewish army did not capture the full 10,000 square miles of mandatory Palestine, and it could have done so at the end of the war because it had basically beaten the Arab armies and it would have faced very little opposition to take over what is today called the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. But they didn't do that. They desisted from that. In other words, they wanted to expand their borders beyond the 6,000, but not the full 10,000, for various reasons. We can go into it afterwards if you like, why the Israeli government, basically Ben Gurion, decided against the full conquest of the land of Israel or all of Palestine. A third war aim accrued, and here we enter an area of controversy, which I believe accrued to Jewish war aims in the war, was to reduce the number of Arabs who would remain in the Jewish state by the end of the war, which meant essentially expulsion, if we want to call it simply. This war aim is visible from more or less April, but it's not all that clear how solid it was as policy. In other words, it wasn't really policy. It was never passed as a resolution in the Israeli cabinet or the general staff of the army, we will expel the Arabs from Palestine. But there was an atmosphere of transfer or expulsion, and Ben Gurion certainly and others in the cabinet and some of the generals wanted as few Arabs remaining in the Jewish state as possible, because these Arabs had just fought against the Jewish state, had tried to destroy it in their view, and they didn't want too many Arab citizens to remain who would be, of course, suspect as disloyal, etc. As I say, there are people who disagree with this and say that the Arab emigration from Palestine or flight from Palestine in 48 wasn't something which was desired or willed in any way by the Israeli leadership, and it just happened. I'll get to that in a second, but as I say, I think it was a sort of war aim, but not formally decided, not turned into formal policy, but there was a spirit in that sense, and Arabs fled the country partly as a result of this, that spirit of the time in this war. The Arab war aims are much more complicated to understand, to fathom in this war. Firstly, because in the civil war, the Arabs of Palestine were led by, as I said, the Arab Higher Committee, whose leadership was in Egypt at the time. It wasn't in Palestine, and it's not clear what exactly they wanted as a war aim. They never declared what their war aim was. The Jews assumed the Palestinian Arab war aim was to throw them into the sea, to kill them all, to commit, if you like, a second Holocaust 3 years after the Holocaust in Europe had occurred. And the Jews believed they were under threat of destruction from this Palestinian Arab assault on them. But the Arabs of Palestine never declared, the leadership never declared what their war aim was. So there's a problem in saying this was their war aim. And the leadership wasn't that formal. As I said, they lived outside of Palestine, most of the members of the Arab Higher Committee. What exactly they told their militiamen in Palestine to do, unclear. We don't know what the orders were, so it's a problem. It becomes even more problematic to understand the war aims of the Arab states. Here, as I said, there are no archives. They're not open. Maybe they exist. Maybe there's good material on this subject in the Arab archives in Cairo, Damascus, etc., but nobody's ever been allowed in to see this material if it actually exists there. So we don't know what the war aims of the Arab states were. And also, we're talking about a number of different states. Lebanon, we know, even though it declared on its radios, in its radio broadcasts, on the 15th, 16th of May, 1948, that they had joined in the Pan-Arab assault, we know for a fact now that they never joined in the assault. Their troops never actually crossed the border. So did they aim to destroy the Jewish state? Well, they didn't participate in the invasion, so it's not clear what war aims they actually had, even though they did become eventually embroiled in the fighting. The Egyptians, we know, the Egyptian army crossed the border, entered area assigned by the United Nations for Jewish statehood, but did it actually intend to get to Tel Aviv, to march on Tel Aviv, to destroy Tel Aviv, to destroy the Jews in the coastal plain where most of the 650,000 Jews who lived in Palestine at the time were concentrated? We don't know. We know they stopped. The army stopped in Isdud, in a place called Ashdod, which is south of Tel Aviv. It's not clear whether it was only because of Israeli resistance to their advance towards Tel Aviv. Maybe it was political. They didn't want to advance on Tel Aviv. We just don't know. They did enter Jewish territory, or a territory assigned by the UN for Jewish statehood. They did invade the Jewish state. Whether they aimed at the destruction of the Jewish state, we don't know. Syria and Iraq, it's likewise. They know they crossed into Israeli territory, especially the Syrians, but also the Iraqis, but we don't know if they intended to get to Haifa. That's what many Israeli military men at the time thought was the aim of the Syrian-Iraqi invasion of the Galilee. It was to get to Afula and then to get to Haifa, but we don't know if that's true. Maybe the Syrians only wanted to capture the Sea of Galilee, just a small chunk of northern Palestine. Maybe that was the aim. Or maybe they thought if it'll work, we'll go to Haifa. If it won't work, we'll stop somewhere early along the route of invasion. So their aim is not that clear. Though, as I say, in Israeli minds at the time, the aim was clear. They believed the Arab states invaded in order to destroy the Jewish state, and that they were fighting for their lives and the lives of their family members just behind them. You have to remember, of course, there's the state of Israel, and that's one of the things I wanted to show here. The area of Palestine is very, very small. If you invade Palestine around the Sea of Galilee, if you see the Syrian-Israeli border or Syrian-Palestine border, there's a little area of blue there. From that point, the blue area, the Sea of Galilee, to the coast, it's about 50 miles. That's the whole width of the state of Israel, or of Palestine at the time. So Israelis can be forgiven and understood in feeling that if they invade Palestine, they might actually be aiming at Haifa, at the coastal area where the Jews were concentrated, perhaps with the aim of destruction. Now, there is a problem in all this in understanding the Arab side in the invasion, the Arab state side, and that is Jordan, whom I haven't mentioned until now. Jordan, we know, and here we have documentation, because the Jordanian Arab Legion, the army of the King of Jordan, of the Kingdom of Jordan, was commanded by British officers. And these British officers sent reports about the progress and what they were doing in the Jordanian army in 1948, they sent them to the Foreign Office in London. And so we have this documentation in the British National Archive of what the Jordanians were thinking and saying. And the Jordanians never intended, and we know that, to destroy the Jewish state or even to invade the Jewish state. They, in fact, were told by Abdallah to limit their invasion to the area assigned for Arab sovereignty, which meant the West Bank. And in addition to that, they decided to take over Arab West Jerusalem, Arab-inhabited West Jerusalem. Jerusalem in the United Nations a partition resolution had been assigned for international control, not Israeli or Arab sovereignty. So in taking West Jerusalem, they weren't actually, they were perhaps violating the UN resolution, but not attacking the Jewish state. The Jordanian army never crossed into the area of the Jewish state as awarded by the United Nations a partition resolution. Nonetheless, the Jordanian and Jewish armies did fight and bitter battles around Jerusalem and on the road to Jerusalem. And these were essentially triggered by fears by the Israelis that the Jordanians did intend to march westward to the coast, to Tel Aviv, and the Jordanian fears that the Israelis intended to march into East Jerusalem and maybe even go down to the Jordan Valley and cut off the Arab army, the Jordanian army, along the Jordan River from its areas of occupation in the West Bank. So they ended up fighting, but the Jordanians did not intend to destroy the Jewish state. And maybe I'll add one more sentence to that. In 1946-47, the Jordanians, in fact, conducted secret negotiations with the Jewish Agency, which was the leadership of the Zionist movement at the time, which changed its name to more or less the Jewish Agency Executive, to the government of Israel. The Jordanians conducted negotiations, secret negotiations with the Israelis to reach an accommodation whereby the Jordanians would take over the West Bank and the Israelis would have more or less the territory the United Nations was about to assign for Jewish sovereignty. So their intention had been to reach an accommodation with the Jews at the expense of the Palestinians, not to conquer the state of Israel. And the war, in fact, ended in this sort of partition between Jordan and the Israelis, the Jordanians taking the West Bank. 1967, as we know, the Israelis ended up in another war with Arab states and then took over the West Bank. But the Jordanians ruled it between 1948 and 1967. A third thing which arose when I was sort of concluding or trying to find a proper conclusion to the discussion of 1948 of the war was the problem of refugees. And I reached the conclusion, it's not just me reaching the conclusion, these are the facts, that actually the war created three refugee problems. We know of one refugee problem, the Palestinian Arab refugee problem, because it exists to this day and is trumpeted day and night by Arab and Palestinian spokesmen, so we know there is a Palestinian refugee problem. I'll talk about it a little more in a second. But the war generated two further refugee problems, which basically people don't know about, because they don't exist any longer. The first was a refugee problem of Israelis displaced by the war in 48. And that's 70,000 Jews were displaced in the course of the war from their homes by the war. 70,000 sounds like a small number, but it's 10% of the Jewish population of Palestine at the time. 10% of Americans would be 30 million Americans displaced in a war. That's a lot of people. 70,000 for the Jews in Palestine was a substantial amount of people displaced by the Arab attacks on various settlements from their homes. Most of them ended up going back to their homes because Israel won the war, reconquered the areas which were lost to the Arabs, and others who had come from areas not reconquered from the Arabs, like the Jewish quarter of the Old City, were resettled in Israel, and the problem of Israeli refugees from the 48 war vanished. 49, no Israeli refugee problem. The third problem created by the war, refugee problem, was of the Jewish communities in the Arab states. From 1948 on, more or less until 1964, the Jews who lived in the Arab states, Syria, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Yemen, Iraq, and so on, were displaced gradually in large numbers in 48-49 itself, and afterwards from places like Morocco until 1964. We're talking about 800,000 Jews who had lived in the Arab states, many of them the communities for 1,000, 2,000, even 2,500 years. Those in Baghdad said they had gone there when the first temple was destroyed in 586 BC. That's where the Jewish community in Baghdad started. All of these Jews were displaced by intimidation by the governments in the countries in which they lived, or by the societies, the Muslim societies amid whom they lived. Intimidation resulting in part because the Arab governments and societies, the Arab inhabitants, suspected these Jews of supporting Israel in the 48 war. They didn't want them any longer. Despite the fact that most of these Jews were non-Zionists, didn't really care much about Zionism, but the 48 war probably did spark a Zionist impulse among many of them. They weren't disloyal, but were suspected of being or potentially being disloyal, and were intimidated into flight by the Arab governments and societies amid whom they lived. One or two Arab governments also expelled Jews. Nasser from Egypt expelled Jews in 56, and there were a few other small expulsions, but most simply fled because they feared what their neighbors and what the governments would do. Iraq arrested most of the leadership of the Jewish community in Iraq in 1948-49, put them in concentration camps, tortured several dozen to death. The same happened in Egypt. They had good reason to fear continued existence as a suspect and a hostile minority, as they saw it in the Arab states, and they left. Later, some Israelis were to argue what had happened, in fact, was an exchange of population, not agreed upon, but Arabs fled Palestine, moved out of Palestine, or at least moved out of the area of Israel into Arab parts of Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza Strip. And Jews had moved out of the Arab states. Most of them, incidentally, arrived in Israel. The poorer ones resettled in Israel, became Israeli citizens. The wealthier ones, the minority, ended up in England and France, essentially. They were absorbed by the societies into which where they resettled, and no refugee problem remains of Arab Jews from Arab lands. So we end up with only the refugee problem. If you like, I'll talk more about the Palestinian refugee problem. If you want to ask me about it, why it happened, what exactly happened, we can talk about that. I spent quite a lot of time writing about that. A fourth, I'll just conclude with that, and then we can open the floor to discussion. A fourth subject which arose is the problem of the balance of forces, or who was the stronger side in the 48 war. Well, I came to the conclusion, and this was a conclusion actually also arrived at by Ben-Gurion in secret talks, secret meetings. He said that quite publicly, quite strongly, not publicly, but the stronger side won in the 48 war, as happens in most wars. The stronger side usually wins. And the stronger side in this war, as strange as it may seem, was the Zionist side. And there's a paradox here, of course. I really should put up another map just to show you where the paradox lies. Paradox lies in the fact that this isn't even a full map of the paradox, but it's not doing anything. Sorry. The paradox lies in the fact that Palestine, Israel, as you see it here, that little, well, I don't know if you can see it, but it's sort of wedged between Jordan and Egypt, a very small sliver of land, is very small by comparison geographically and demographically and essentially economically by comparison to the Arab Middle East. And that Arab Middle East actually stretches in terms of the fighting in 48 down to the Atlantic Ocean. In other words, after Egypt, you've got Libya and Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco, whatever, more or less in that order. And this area had in 1948, I don't know, 10 times more population than the Jews, 20 times, 30 times. The Jews of Palestine, 650,000. The Arab world, something like 50 million people. Work out the arithmetic. Potentially, their economic power was much larger, and that should have translated into military power, but it didn't. So you've got this vast Arab world with vast economic and human resources who are fighting this very small community of 650,000 Jews, and you would think the Jews are the weaker side in this battle. But as it turns out, the Arab world didn't mobilize properly for the war, didn't prepare properly for the war, sent expeditionary forces to fight in Palestine after the civil war ended and the Palestinians lost in the civil war. But the numbers of troops they sent were smaller than the number of troops the Jews, 650,000, managed to mobilize from within that small community. The Israeli army at the end of 1948 mustered 110,000 people under arms, 110,000 out of a population of, by the end of 48, 700,000 people. The Arab world sent into battle in this fight something like 50 to 60 at the very most thousand troops. 50, 60,000 troops. So in fact, even in terms of numbers, they were smaller than the Jewish side. The Jewish side was the stronger side, and it won the war. But this isn't, of course, the only component of strength, numbers. The Arab side definitely had better arms and was better armed, certainly not the Palestinians, but the Arab states' armies when they invaded Palestine on the 15th of May, 1948. They had tanks, they had a combat aircraft, they had cannon. The Jewish side had none of this because the British who ruled Palestine had basically prevented the Jews from acquiring heavy equipment before the British left. So the Jews had to fight tanks with Molotov cocktails for the first few weeks and so on. So they were weaker in terms of armaments, but had more troops than the Arab sides which invaded. Gradually, this disparity in armaments was reduced, and eventually, by the end of the war, the Jewish side had better armaments than the Arab side, because the Arab side was not resupplied during the war by the British and French, their traditional suppliers. As they lost equipment, they weren't able to replace it. As they lost planes, they weren't able to replace them. As they lost pilots, they weren't able to replace them. They didn't have the know-how or actually the money and equipment to do that. The Jews did. They had the support of American Jewry, which gave Israel a lot of money during the war, over $100 million, with which they were able to purchase on the black market and in Czechoslovakia arms. The Czechs were willing to sell the Jews arms. They didn't really care about United Nations decisions to embargo the whole Middle East against arms shipments. So the Jews, as I say, ended up also closing and eventually surpassing the Arabs in terms of the disparity in armaments. And in terms of the know-how of the troops, probably the Israeli troops were also better, more educated. Some of them had combat experience from World War II in the British Army. 28,000 Palestinian Jews had served in the British Army in World War II. Thousands had served in the Russian Army. Many had served in the British and in the American and Canadian armies, and some came from there and volunteered to fight on the Israeli side, especially, incidentally, pilots. Some of whom weren't even Jewish. Some Jewish pilots from World War II came and fought on the Israeli side, and non-Jews came for the adventure, for the money, for whatever, and fought on the Israeli side. The Arabs had very few qualified pilots. The moment these were all shot down, that was basically the end of the Arab air forces. So even if they had the planes, they didn't have the people to service them or use them. So the problem of the balance of forces in the war, and it has an important element which is beyond the military, and that is the moral element. The Jews were able to depict themselves as the weaker party because of this map of the Middle East and the demography, and because the Arabs hadn't attacked them, and so had the moral high ground, which enabled them to get Western political support and economic support during the war and after the war, even though they were the stronger side, but they portrayed themselves and convincingly that they were the weaker side. The Arab side, as I said, were seen as the stronger, the bully. They had been the aggressors, and so lost in that moral battle, which translated into political gain or loss, and this was important as well. Okay, I'll leave it at that and leave the floor open for questions.
who'd like to ask a question, we have mics available. If you want to step up and ask a question, please feel free. While you're mulling it over, Benny, I have a question, if I may.
Sure.
Take the honor of the first question. What about the moral high ground today, given the ongoing, what about the moral question today? You talked about the displacement of Palestinians as, in effect, a kind of a war aim of sorts of the Israelis, 700,000 people.
700,000 were displaced from their homes.
Palestinians lost their homes, now populating Gaza and the West Bank. Who has the moral high ground today when it looks to many people of the world like those people should be able to go back to their homes? Why not open the borders of Gaza and the West Bank and end this displacement of innocent civilian people and their descendants?
Okay. In the 48 war, 700,000 Arabs were displaced from their homes. Another 160,000 Arabs remained inside the area of the State of Israel and became Israeli citizens. Had Israel allowed the Palestinian refugees to return in 1949, the 700,000 who were displaced, there would have been 870,000 Arabs in the Jewish state as opposed to 700,000 Jews. In other words, no Jewish state, an Arab majority state. The same applied down the decades and applies to this day, and that is why all Israeli governments since 1948, all of them, Labor, right, left, whatever, have opposed what's called the right of return. The Palestinians demand that they be allowed, their refugees be allowed to return. Of the 700,000 original Palestinian refugees, and there's a problem with the word refugees because most of the 700,000 ended up in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which were part of Palestine. And a refugee is normally defined, look at the dictionary, as somebody who is displaced from not his home, but his country. They weren't, most of them, displaced from their country. They ended up inside the country called Palestine at the time. But 700,000 were displaced from their homes. Probably several tens of thousands of those original 700,000 are still alive today, 80-year-old, 90-year-old, whatever. But the United Nations on its rolls have 5 to 6 million Palestinian refugees, meaning the descendants, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of those original 700,000. Were 5 million Palestinian refugees allowed back into the area which became in 1948 the State of Israel, there would be them plus the 150,000 who became 1.5 million Israeli Arab citizens. Again, you would more or less have a majority of Arabs in the Jewish state. So in terms of the politics of it, Israel can't allow the return of a mass return of the Palestinian refugees because, who are so designated by the UN, because it would mean the end of a Jewish state. It would be a binational state or perhaps even an Arab majority state. They have much higher birth rates than the Jews, an Arab majority state within a few years. That's the politics of it. Now, when you break it down to the human calculus, you feel, well, somebody who's been displaced from his home by war, even if he fought in a war and tried to destroy the Jews, nonetheless, why should he pay, or his children or grandchildren pay the price, and they should be allowed back home, to their homes, to their original lands and houses and fields and so on. But the problem is that Israel has to calculate in terms of the politics and the military dimensions of the problem, not in terms of each individual and each individual family, because it's a political, a military security problem, and that's Israel's stance to this day, with which I incidentally agree. If you want to maintain a Jewish state, and most Israelis do, they think they have a right to have a state, the Jewish people, like the Arabs have 23 states. The Jews wanted one little state, and they have one little state. The Arabs have 23 states, stretching from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf, and there's nothing unfair about the Jews having a state. And a mass return of the Palestinian refugees would undermine the existence of a Jewish state. That's my sense of it. So you can weigh up, judge the morality of what I'm talking about as you like, but that's the way I see it.
And who would like the next question? I'll bring you the mic. How about that? You don't look eager to run up here, although you may. Would you like to come up? Yeah.
So in your talk, you depicted Israel as the victim of jihadis around Middle East, Palestine.
Can you talk to the right
Yeah,
microphone?
sure.
I can't hear you.
So could you hear me right now? Yeah. So in your talk, you depicted Israelis as victims of jihadis around the Middle East.
I didn't use the word victims.
Yeah, whatever. Palestinians are Muslims and Coptic Christians, and they are defending their lands against invasion of others. Actually, like Israel is not secular. Israel is a Jewish state by the Israeli Jewish nation. It's like an article in 2018. So Israel is not secular, as you said. It's Jewish by law in Israel. In 1948, Nobel Award Einstein wrote a warning letter to the New York Times about the Herut Party in Israel, which is now known as Likud Party, the ruling party in Israel for decades of Begin, Sharon, and currently Netanyahu, with bloody history of massacres against Palestinian people, like Deir Yassin, which was mentioned in Einstein's letter, that took place just before the 1948.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. It's coming right now. Einstein compared the Herut Party to the Nazi Party. The letter could be found on Harvard website. In 2007, former Israeli Attorney General Michael Binyar said in an article in Telegraph, "We enthusiastically chose to become a colonial society, ignoring international treaties, engaging in theft of land, and finding justification for everything." This is the Attorney General of Israel. In Israel, we have two judicial systems, one progressive, liberal for Israelis, another cruel in the occupied territories for Palestinians. Basically, this for Palestinians.
Can you reach the question?
Actually,
I understand you don't like Israel, but can you reach a question?
rather than justice. I mean, like, okay. If anyone wants to learn more about the Palestinian Zionist conflict, please read "Palestine: Peace, Not Apartheid" by Jimmy Carter, and "The General's Sons" by Mike Pelite, and "Mornings of Jenin" by Susanna Bulhawa, "Understanding Power of Chomsky." Here is the question: don't you think today, by saying that Palestinians are the ones who are aggressive, and you're simply basically blaming the oppressed people rather than blaming the oppressor?
I think I understood some of it. I did catch something in the middle of what you said, and you said the Jewish state is not secular because it wants to be Jewish.
No, it's Jewish by law. You could find an article on BBC in July 2018.
Okay, can I
sure.
I heard that.
Yeah.
Yasser Arafat always said, the Jews are not a people, the Jews are a religion. And that's essentially what you're echoing when you're saying the Jewish state is not a secular state. Well, the Jewish state happens to be a secular state. It has a growing religious minority who are becoming more and more important and influential in government and in legislation, but it still remains a secular state because the Jews are a people. In addition to being a religion, it's a bit confusing for people, but that's what they are. The same as Armenians are a people, but also basically a religion. I don't accept your definition of Israel as an oppressive society. I think it ended up in occupation of Palestinian territories in '67 as a result of Arab aggression and has been unable to disentangle itself from the West Bank as most Israelis would like to do.
So having two judicial systems
No, I think you should give somebody else a chance as well.
nothing oppressing with it. Having like a system for people, a group of people, another system for it's actually like a system for injustice.
Okay, I understood what you're saying. There are two systems in Israel: one for the people who live in the occupied territories, who are not Israeli citizens, and another for the people who are Israeli citizens. But those who are Israeli citizens include 1.5 million Arabs who have full voting rights, are represented in the Knesset, sometimes in government, at the moment in government as well, in the Supreme Court. They have every right Israelis have. They don't serve in the army, they don't do certain things, but they essentially enjoy exactly the same rights as Jewish Israelis. It's true that in the occupied territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which are sort of self-ruled at the moment, they're not fully occupied, there is a different system of governance, but that's occupied territories, which, as I said, I think most Israelis, if you look at opinion polls, would like to get out of, but are unable to do so in the absence of a peace treaty, which the Palestinians refuse to give Israel. That's my view, but I know you have other views.
Yeah, actually, you could see like the trend of like moving like settlements of Israelis from like
there is Israeli settlement in the occupied territories, which I disagree with.
Yeah, I'm like
which I disagree with, and makes it more difficult to disentangle from the territories. That's the point you're making, and it's true. But maybe let me just remind you of one small thing. In 1937, 1947, 2000, 2008, the Jewish Zionist side, the Israelis, offered a partition settlement, in other words, a two-state solution to the various Palestinian leaders, Haj Amin al-Husseini, Yasser Arafat, Abbas, and each time the Israeli offers of a peace treaty based on two states was rejected. That's why Israel has been unable to disentangle itself from the territories. But you're right, there are also settlements in the territories which make the job of disentanglement more difficult.
And so this is what we mean by viewpoint diversity here at the Center for Academic and Intellectual Freedom. We encourage robust dialogue, and thank you for your question. Is there another question? Who's next? Would you like to step up to the mic? Great.
Speak to the microphone. It's lower it a bit. Yeah,
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
barely.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Could you speak about the collective precedent of the major Arab players closing their archives pertaining to the 1948 war? One, are the archives closed to respected Arab historians, regional and/or foreign born? Two, can you extrapolate how this limited access to knowledge feeds sort of the level of reiterated rhetoric pertaining to Israel that's gone on for decades and repeats itself? And I guess this question, would we be looking at a different Middle Eastern canvas these last 7 decades if facts or knowledge would have been more evenly shared? Would our dialogue have been different? About the archives not being closed was actually new to me, and thank you for bringing that up.
I got the question.
And to close, please see the documentary Above and Beyond about the fledgling Israeli Air Force. You mentioned the wars.
Okay. It's unfortunate that the archives of the Arab states are essentially closed, and it's not just about the 48 war, it's about the whole of Arab national existence. Anybody who writes, for instance, about the rise of modern Syria, or any subject, the Jordanian, the history of Jordan, essentially bases himself on British archives, French archives, Israeli intelligence archives, American archives, UN archives, not on Arab archives because they're simply not open to anybody, not just Israelis or Americans, but Arab scholars as well. Any Arab scholar who wants to do any honest work on Arab history essentially does it in America. He can't do it in his own country for various reasons. But one of them being that the archives are simply not open. I had difficulty writing about 48 war or other Israeli wars because the Arab archives are closed, and you have to penetrate the Arab side through American, British, French diplomatic correspondence, reports, etc., of diplomats meeting kings, generals, etc., or Israeli intelligence or British intelligence penetration of the Arab world. It can't be done on the basis of Arab material because it's not open. Whether opening Arab archives, and they're dictatorships, that's essentially why they close their archives. That's what dictatorships do, they don't open archives. Whether the opening of the archive would facilitate or improve the chances of Israeli-Arab peace, I don't know. In fact, I have my doubts if they were opened and whatever material they found there. I'll just give you an instance. There's a man called Moti Golani in Israel, an historian now in Tel Aviv University, who wrote a book about the 1956 war. In his MA thesis, it wasn't put in the book eventually for various reasons. It came out of the IDF press. They didn't want it put in. But in his in his PhD about the 56 war, he included a small episode in which Israeli troops had massacred Egyptian POWs at the Mitla Pass. They captured 20 Egyptians and killed them, Egyptian prisoners, this group of Israeli paratroops who had landed deep inside the Sinai Peninsula in 1956. They couldn't keep them, they couldn't hold prisoners. It doesn't matter what the reasons were, but this caused the moment this appeared in his PhD thesis, which was then picked up by an Israeli journalist and wrote about it, this of course caused a problem between Israel and Egypt. Egypt demanded that Israel set up a commission of inquiry to look into this massacre 50 years before, in 1956. In other words, what I'm saying is the opening of archives doesn't necessarily facilitate goodwill and peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors. It can do the opposite. I'm not sure what would occur. What the opening of the Arab archives would do, if the material exists there, and we don't know if it exists there because we don't know what's there, because it's all closed, but if the material really existed there, we would know more about Arab thinking, Arab decision-making, etc., which would round out the picture much better than we can do through diplomatic and intelligence penetration of the Arab world. It would help historians to get a fuller picture, myself included, of but that's basically not possible as the Arab archives remain closed.
Well, welcome. Glad to have you up in the UP.
Thank you.
It's not the end of the world, but we can see it from here, right?
I'm not hearing.
Never mind. Could you touch a little bit on perhaps prior to 1948, going back 2, 3, 4 generations, on what the people were like and what was happening and taking place with the people in the Palestinian lands? Were they fighting? I mean, were they? What was happening with the people? Do you suppose? You don't have to go back 1,000 years, but maybe 2, 3 generations.
Well, we have from the Ottoman archives, and then from the early British mandatory archives, we know more or less what the situation in Palestine was, what was occurring among the Arabs of Palestine. And essentially they lived, it was a rural and agrarian community, not industrial, essentially illiterate, except for an upper class which read and wrote, was able to read and write. And they lived off the land and were apolitical, essentially. They lived as subjects of the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs of Palestine, I'm talking about the year 1800, 1880, 1900. They didn't care about the majority. The vast majority had no interest in politics or nationalism. But the upper class, which had been touched by winds from Europe of nationalism, began to think in terms of Arab national revival. And that was the situation, and Jews began in small numbers to arrive in Palestine and establish settlements in Palestine, what was called eventually the Zionist enterprise. Life under the Ottomans was not very easy. The heavy taxation, they took the children to wars in all sorts of places like the Caucasus. But the country steadily improved, and Zionists and Israeli historians tended to say that the improvement of Palestine in terms of its economy, agriculture, etc., occurred because of the Zionist influx into the country. It's only partly true. That actually began with reforms in the Ottoman administration in the middle of the 19th century, and certainly the British administration from 1917-18 on vastly improved the country, and therefore the lives and welfare and so on of the Arabs who lived in Palestine. I don't know what else you want from me. I mean, I can talk about it endlessly. The chapters about this in one of my books, Righteous Victims, about the Turkish period and the British Mandate period. What can be said about the Palestinian Arabs, perhaps this is an important point, is they identified themselves before the year 1920. This I think I can say more or less factually. The Arabs who lived in Palestine identified themselves by the city or town or village in which they lived. I'm a Haifite, a Jaffaite, a Gazan, etc. They saw themselves as subjects of the Ottoman Empire. They saw themselves as Muslims, and in some way they understood that the land on which they lived was the Holy Land, and therefore they were residents of the Holy Land. They didn't identify themselves as Palestinians, and if they thought in territorial terms, they thought of themselves as southern Syrians, because Palestine had traditionally, in the Ottoman administration, been part of Syria, of the greater Syria area, Balad el-Sham as it was called, and Palestine was the southern part of that. So they saw themselves, if anything, geographically, as I say, apart from a local identity, they saw themselves as southern Syrians. 1920 is the year in which there's a cutoff and something changes. In 1920, the French take over Syria. The French, who had landed in Beirut and Lebanon in 1918, conquered Damascus and took over Syria in 1920. And the British had established themselves in Palestine. And from that point on, the Arabs who lived in Palestine began to see that their future, their trajectory, was separate from that of Damascus and Syria, because those areas were under French domination and they were living under the British side by side with a burgeoning Zionist presence. And so they had a different enemy and a different overlord, and they would have to seek their own future without or against these neighbors or overlords, and from that point on emerges a Palestinian national identity, a national movement, consciousness, and eventually a Palestinian identity, which by 1948 they begin to call themselves, even then not so much, but Palestinian Arabs. Before that, they're not really called, they don't call themselves Palestinian Arabs, essentially. It's something which comes into common usage in the 60s, in fact, the term Palestinians. But the Arabs of Palestine before 1948, that's how they see themselves and are known. But from 1920, there begins a growth of national consciousness, a separate national consciousness from that of Arabs in Syria, Arabs in Jordan, Arabs in Lebanon. Yes, sorry, yeah.
You mentioned the Jews who left Arab countries between 1947 and the 1960s, and that the majority of those actually were resettled in Israel. What efforts have been made by the Arab countries to support and or resettle or relocate the Palestinian refugees?
Well, these are separate issues, but the Arab states, Israel in 1948 decided not to allow the refugees to return to their homes. Those who had been displaced from their homes, the Palestinian Arabs, they weren't, by Israeli government decision, there was never a decision to expel them, but there was a decision not to allow them back once they were out. The Arab states who had taken in the Palestinian refugees in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the Jordanians in the West Bank, the Egyptians in the Gaza Strip, the Syrians in Syria, the Lebanese in Lebanon, didn't give them, apart from Jordan, didn't give them citizenship. And to this day, the Arabs who live, the Palestinians who live in Lebanon and Syria do not have Lebanese or Syrian citizenship. The Arabs of the Gaza Strip do not have Egyptian citizenship because the Arab states didn't want to take them in. They didn't want to take them in partly because they were seen as a subversive influx of impoverished people, of different people. They weren't Egyptians, they weren't Syrians, they weren't Lebanese. In part because they thought, the Arab states, that it would be just that the Palestinian refugees should be allowed back into their homes in Palestine. So if we give them citizenship and resettle them properly in orderly fashion in our states, in Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, in Syria and Lebanon, then we'll reduce their will to return, and this will be unjust because they should be returning to their homes. In addition, the Arab states saw the Palestinian Arabs as a ready-made battering ram against Israel, a battering ram in terms of propaganda. Here, the bad Israelis had thrown these poor people out. They were living in misery in camps around Palestine. They want to go back to their homes. Israelis won't let them back. So they were a good political propaganda battering ram against Israel. And in addition, the Arab states saw that they had some value as potential terrorists and recruited among them terrorists, the Jordanian, the Syrian regime, the Egyptian regime, recruited in the camps people who would go and terrorize Israel because these regimes hated Israel as well. So they had ready-made guerrillas or terrorists, whatever you want to call them, in these camps. So they helped to perpetuate it. In addition, you have to remember the Arab states were poor. Saudi Arabia is not poor, Kuwait's not poor, but these aren't the frontline Arab states. The states next to Israel, the Syrians, the Egyptian state, the Jordanian state, these are poor countries, and for them to absorb masses of Palestinians may have even been a burden beyond their capabilities in terms of the economics of it. So there's a whole variety of reasons why they weren't absorbed in the Arab countries, but I think essentially it was because they didn't want Israel to exist and were happy to have this instrument to hit Israel with, called the Palestinian refugees. I think that answers more or less what you asked. The main difference, one last point which maybe I should have made, maybe it's obvious, but the difference between the Palestinian and the Jewish refugees from Arab countries is very simple. The Palestinian refugees do want to return somewhere because many of them don't have citizenship in the countries in which they reside, whereas the Jews from Arab lands do not want to go back to Syria, Egypt, Yemen, Baghdad, Morocco, whatever. They have no will to return to the countries from which they fled or were driven out. So there's a basic difference in those two refugee problems and why one of them exists and one doesn't exist. Yeah, sure.
Professor Morris, thank you for your insight on the history of the State of Israel. I'd like to ask your thoughts on the future, given the conflict of the Sunni and Shia Muslims in the Arab states. How might that affect the security and the future of the State of Israel?
I don't know. Firstly, my wife always says, you know a little bit about the past, don't talk about the future of which you know very little or nothing. So I really shouldn't say anything about the future. At the moment, there is an ongoing feud or conflict between Sunnis and Shiites. Maybe people exaggerate in how deep this conflict is, but there is some sort of conflict going on in the Arab Muslim world between these two streams of Islam. And I don't know how it will affect Israel in the future. It seems that at the moment that Israel and the Sunnis, Israel and the rulers of Egypt, the rulers of Saudi Arabia, have a common interest in being not anti-Shia so much as anti-Iranian. Iran poses a threat to Israel and to Saudi Arabia and the regimes along the Gulf and so on. So they have a sort of a common interest. Whether that will translate into Israeli-Saudi peace or Israeli-Kuwaiti or Emirati peace, I don't know. It doesn't seem to be likely. But there is some sort of common interest because each of them is fearful of Iran's threats and expansionism.
Hello. I have two questions, actually. The first one is a yes or no. In your view, does
Is
Israel...
a yes or no?
Yes.
There's no such thing in history.
Well, in your view, does Israel still have the moral high ground?
As I said, there's no yes or no in these things. It has some of the moral high ground. I think I said before, I believe there should be a Jewish state. I believe that the Palestinian Arabs have been trying essentially to destroy the Jewish state for 100 years, and the Arab states joined them at various stages, less so today. So in that sense, there is a moral high ground. It's moral that the Jews should have a state. That's essentially what it's about. On the other hand, the Jews are in occupation of another people and ruling their lives in various ways, some of them quite awful, in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and that's not moral, but it's sort of the dictate of the situation at the moment. That's how it seems to be working out. That's what I would say.
Oh, thank you very much.
You had two questions, you said.
All right. How does the State of Israel defend the Israeli army's use of children as human shields?
How does it defend what?
How would you defend the Israeli army's use of children as human shields, the internationally condemned West Bank wall, or the 10-year blockade on Gaza?
The different questions. Israel essentially does not use children as human shields. This is a simple lie. There were times during the suppression of the second intifada, the second rebellion, when some Israeli troops, I don't know if they used children, they used Arab as human shields when they tried to enter a house where there were terrorists. This happened. I don't know if it's moral or immoral. Fighting terrorists is very difficult, as everybody knows. Or fighting guerrillas is very difficult as well. The wall is what you call the wall, which actually is mostly a fence. It's about 10% wall and 90% just a fence, is a different question altogether. There is a fence which was built almost along the whole of the Israeli West Bank border during the 2000s and after 2010. And it was built essentially to keep out terrorists, because the border was open, there was no fence, and terrorists were entering Israel during the Second Intifada, blowing themselves up in buses and restaurants, etc. And Arik Sharon, the prime minister at the time, said, we need a wall to keep these guys out. Without a fence or a wall, they will have too many terrorist attacks on Israel. And it has worked in that sense. There are very few terrorist attacks since this fence was established. But the truth is that the fence served two purposes. The first was this anti-terrorist purpose, which I think is 100% I'm in agreement with. The second purpose was to delineate a future border between Israel and the West Bank. Should there be a West Bank Palestinian state, this fence would more or less delineate the border, and the fence runs more or less along the old border between the West Bank and Israel. It incorporates maybe 5 to 8% of the West Bank as well, but if you like, stealing a little bit of territory, but it's essentially along that border. And Arik Sharon, when he built it, I think thought of the wall, this fence, as something which would delineate the future Israeli West Bank Palestine border, if there is ever a Palestine state. Which is why, incidentally, religious Israelis and the settlers hate the wall, because they think that it leaves them on the wrong side of the wall inside the West Bank, whereas they want to think of the whole territory down to the Jordan River as part of the state of Israel.
Thank you.
Hey, how's it going?
Just not too bad.
I was hoping you could shed a little bit more light on the events, I guess, culminating out of the end of World War II as to how that influenced tension currently in the contemporary set.
I'm not sure what that means. How the events after World War II did what?
Yeah, well, yeah, there was a lot of Jewish diaspora, like, in Europe, so.
Okay. In other words, the effect of the Second World War on the conflict, that's what you're saying. Well, it certainly had a major effect on the Israeli-Arab conflict. On the one hand, World War II, meaning the Nazis who killed 6 million Jews, deprived the Zionist enterprise of its manpower, of its potential manpower, those who would perhaps settle in Israel if it was ever established. This was one of the major things which it did. It implanted in the Jews a terrible sense of insecurity that the world would allow the killing of 6 million Jews, and therefore when the Arabs began their attacks on Israel in 47, 48, there was a sense there that the world again is leaving us at the mercy of potential mass murderers. So in that sense, it had a very big impact. It had a major impact on the Arab world in the sense that, like World War I, it advanced the independence of the Arab societies. They transformed in the course of World War II into independent states. So it enhanced Arab power. They turned from peoples who were living under French or British subjection into independent states. Syria, Lebanon got their independence in 46. So did Jordan. Egypt became more independent following World War II as a result of the decolonization process, which was started by World War II. The war had all sorts of other effects. Jews fought in World War II because they had a common enemy with England and France in Nazi Germany. They fought against the Nazis in British ranks and Russian ranks and the American army. And so, in a sense, World War II trained a lot of Palestine's Jews and other Jews who came to Palestine for combat, which made Israel more proficient. Its army, when it faced the Arab armies in 1948, these Arab armies had not fought in World War II, save some parts of the Arab Legion, the Jordanian army, but essentially the Arabs stayed out. In fact, the Arab states, by and large, supported the Germans in World War II, not because they were Nazis, but because they saw in the British a common enemy. That is, the Germans didn't like the British, they didn't like the French, and the Arabs didn't like the French and the British because the British and French were ruling over them. So the Arabs sided with the Germans with the Axis in World War II, essentially. This was to their detriment politically, 1947-48, when the Western world essentially mobilized in support of Israel as did Russia, partly because of the Arab commitment to the Axis in World War II. There's lots of things which World War II did, but I'm just naming a few of them.
Cool. Thank you.
What effect, excuse me, what effect, if any, do you think the unilateral removal of occupation from Gaza under Sharon and its eventual result as far as relationships between the government that's in Gaza and Israel, what type of effect did that have going forward on Israel trying to make peace with the West Bank?
Okay. Let me add one more thing, which I should have said in response to the previous question, and that is that the main Palestinian leader, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the leader in the 30s and 40s of the Palestine Arab National Movement, spent most of the war years, 1940-45, World War II, in Germany, in the pay of the German government, raising troops for the German army, even the SS. And this, again, made him unworthy in terms of the British and in terms of the Americans, and decreased support in Britain and America for Palestinian nationalism. As a result of this cooperation of the head of the Palestine National Movement with the Nazis in World War II. But as to the question you asked, what happened in Gaza, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip under Prime Minister Sharon. It pulled out its troops and dismantled its settlements in the Gaza Strip in 2005. And following that, missiles were essentially rained down on Israeli border settlements from the Gaza Strip by the Hamas, which took charge of the Gaza Strip. And in a sense, this undermined the possible peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. And here we're talking about the future of the West Bank, because Israelis said, well, if this is what happens in a territory which we vacate, the Gaza Strip, it turns into a base for launching of missiles against Israel. What will happen in the West Bank, which is closer to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the main concentrations of Jewish population? That area too, the West Bank, will fall under Hamas rule, and missiles, Katyushas, will start flying from there into Israel. So it made Israelis more reluctant to give up the West Bank to the Palestinians. It was bad for the peace process, or thinking about the future of peace with the Palestinians living in the West Bank.
We have time for perhaps one or two more questions. Are there any more questions?
So maybe I've answered everything.
You may just have solved the whole issue of the...
Say that again?
You may have covered this topic, yeah?
I was just wondering if you could go into more detail about the United Nations resolution as far as what it had in mind for Jerusalem.
Okay, it's really fairly simple. There's nothing complicated here. In 1947, in November, the United Nations General Assembly, in passing Resolution 181, decided to divide Palestine, to establish in Palestine, in a partitioned Palestine, two states, one Arab, one Jewish, but it exempted from these two states the area of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Jerusalem and Bethlehem were seen as the sites, the holy sites of the three religions, including Christianity. Most Christian states were reluctant to hand over these areas, including the Church of Nativity, the various churches which are important, the Holy Sepulchre, were reluctant to hand these over to Jewish control or Muslim control. And they also figured if we give it to one of them, the other side won't like it. That is, Israelis will resent it if the area is given to Muslim control and vice versa. So the United Nations decided to exempt these areas from control of the Jews or the Arabs, and they were to be administered by United Nations Trusteeship Council. That was the decision. The citizens in these areas were given the right, as far as I remember, to receive citizenship of either of the two states. In other words, the territory was controlled by was to be controlled by the UN, but the citizens were allowed, the people living there were allowed to become citizens of either of the two states if they wanted to. And this was the basis, incidentally, the UN partition resolution, for the fact that most Western governments didn't recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and refused to establish embassies there because that area had been designated by the United Nations, the world community, as something which was to be under world community control rather than Israeli or Jordanian or Arabia. I think most governments, though, today say, leaving aside the resolution of 47, should there be an Israeli-Arab peace and an agreement on how to divide Jerusalem between Israel and the Palestinians, that would be sufficient to establish embassies, recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and perhaps other parts of Jerusalem as the Palestinian capital.
If I can get a follow-up. Would both states have military troops allowed in Jerusalem? And
No. The decision, I don't think it was the UN resolution, though. The armistice agreement between Israel and Jordan having occupied East Jerusalem and the Israelis having occupied West Jerusalem, the armistice agreement between these two states limited the number of troops either country could have in Jerusalem. And usually it was violated by both sides.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have one last question for you, Benny. Americans are pragmatic people. When we see a problem, we want to solve it. We wonder, how can we fix it? What is to be done? Is there a two-state solution on the horizon? Do you believe in a two-state solution? To pick up on what my colleague said earlier, Israel can look like the oppressor now, given that it's a wealthy and strong country and the Palestinians are occupied. Where do we go from here? I'm not asking you to predict. I'm asking you what is to be hoped for, what can we support? Is there a two-state solution? Is it possible? Is it desirable? Or what is to be done?
Well, I've always been in favor of a two-state solution. I think it gives an a minimum of justice to both peoples. The Palestinians, who now see themselves as a people, who have seen themselves as a people for several decades now, should have a state of their own and self-government and self-determination. The Jews also should have a state of their own. So partition makes sense and a two-state solution makes sense. The problem is that I don't think it's practical. In other words, I support it in terms of theory, but I don't think anybody's going to do it. I don't think the Palestinians have, in their hearts, accommodated themselves to the existence of a Jewish state on most of Palestine, of traditional Palestine. They don't think that's just, and they won't agree, haven't until now, and I don't see them doing it any time in the future, agreeing to a two-state solution which includes a Jewish sovereignty over much of Palestine. And in Israel also, I don't think most Israelis believe a two-state solution is possible, and Israeli governments, recent Israeli governments, the right-wing governments, have established settlements there which are an obstacle to separating into two states, and also there's a reluctance to give up the West Bank by the Israeli government. And this reluctance has grown stronger over the years because the demography has worked in favor of the right in Israel.
Well, thank you very much, Benny, for a very enlightening explanation of a very complicated topic. And thanks to all of you for coming out on a rainy night. When Greg Lukianoff comes later this month, he's the CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education and a great advocate for free speech. We can point to this event to show that people like yourselves are willing to engage in difficult conversations and have a dialogue as we have done tonight. If we can talk openly and critically and thoughtfully and even disagree about the Arab-Israeli conflict, then I think we can hold our heads up and say that free speech is alive and well here at NMU. So thanks to you, and Benny Morris, thank you very, very much.